Hello. This talk was originally given to SIEM members at their summer conference. It's about the benefits of anthropogenic ponds in the context of rewilding. There's this common perception of rewilding that it's just leaving land to heal itself, but in the UK, land abandonment often has poor results for nature. Genuinely successful rewilding projects have a good mix of close proximity to biodiverse sources of seed, consistent, diverse herbivore activity, and crucially, a topology and hydrology which has remained wild or has been restored to a wild state. This last factor is what I'm here to talk about today, the loss of ponds and how bringing them back can impact the wider ecosystem. Because much of our land is heavily degraded, the structure fundamentally altered by mechanical interventions, essentially flattened for agriculture. Taking a look at old maps can begin to show us some of our more recent losses, though these are only a proportion of the overall picture. This example is from near my own land. Here you can see that 7 ponds have been lost in less than 20 fields. In just one study, it was found that the number of ponds declined by 55% from 1870 to 1960, reflecting wider trends across Europe. A field without ponds is now the new norm, so it's difficult to shift mindsets. They're now viewed as a hazard rather than as a natural asset. While many of these ponds were filled in or ploughed over, others were lost due to a lack of management, causing succession. These habitats aren't considered beneficial to productivity anymore. Modern fields often have steel water troughs, and these replace the function, but without those crucial ecological benefits. When rewilding land though, if we want to restore a truly balanced ecosystem, we need to bring in heavy machinery to undo this flattening and the draining of previous centuries. This may seem antithetical to a rewilding mindset, but actually, disturbance is a key principle in Perino et al.'s 2019 definition of European rewilding. Ponds are not only a source of aquatic biodiversity, but also support transient wildlife, from herons to foxes. At the muddy margins, you'll see it's like a Serengeti watering hole, with footprints of many different species. These animals don't live at the pond, but pass through, using it as a hunting spot, a source of water, or a place to find wet clay for the nesting material. The edges of this habitat are seasonally inundated, creating this biodiverse ecotone with a multitude of different plants, which in turn supports a wealth of different invertebrates. When you dig a pond, you're not just creating a hole, but a hill too, where this soil is dumped. Warm, south-facing butterfly banks and soggy, north-facing seeps that extend the habitat's impact beyond what might typically be considered the pond's margins. But we tend to underestimate these benefits and focus instead on biodiversity within the water itself because, that's just easier to measure, isn't it? eDNA analysis and water sampling are fundamental tools in ecology. This focus has led us to undervalue these ecosystems in ecology. Ponds are stuck behind wetlands, rivers, and streams in priority, as you can see in this graph. Efforts to increase rural pond coverage are so underfunded that their impact tends to be underwhelming. The first 4 years of the Million Ponds project delivered just 5,000 ponds, but we've lost an estimated 500,000 or more, according to a 2005 report. Ponds are such a fundamental part of many ecosystems that we forget how reliant wildlife is on these water sources. When reintroducing bison, a key part of the preparation process is creating new ponds to support these animals and allow them to range further, especially during dry and hot conditions. At Wildebleen in Kent, Stan Smith, who ran the Bison Rewilding project, said that they increased the number of ponds within the 50-hectare ecosystem to around 25 before the bison were let in. And a similar effort was made in Poland, where new anthropogenic ponds were found to be home to more species of dragonfly than naturally occurring local reservoirs, as you can see in the graph below, likely due to shading of the margins in more established habitats. Shady margins are an issue with established water bodies, and the stochastic creation of new ponds can mitigate this. It can also mitigate invasions of non-native species like swamp stonecrop, which are highly resistant to control measures. The beauty of ponds is that much of this biodiversity can pack up and leave with very little notice. Even fish and plants are specifically adapted to the ephemeral nature of ponds, with eggs and seeds that are easily dispersed from one location to another. In truly wild landscapes like this one, natural processes create new ponds, but we no longer see this at work in most of our country. These processes include river meandering leading to oxbow lakes, beaver damming, herbivore excavation of waterholes, and glacial or periglacial processes. Our rural ponds are just not being replaced at the same rate as they're being destroyed. That's why anthropogenic ponds are so important, although they're not perfect equivalents. It's crucial when creating them to follow biosecurity processes, reducing the risk of spreading invasive species. But what results can we get when we create a pond de novo? Is this effort really worth it? EcoSealers investigated this question on a site in West Sussex. This pond is 20 metres by 90, created for a flood alleviation scheme protecting Gatwick Airport. This is a nature-based solution which benefits both wildlife and people, in line with Rewilding Europe's definition of rewilding. It's also in line with our focus on active rewilding, as we planted a variety of different native species, from yellow flag iris to purple loosestrife, kicking off this biodiversity much faster than in a naturally occurring new pond, except an oxbow lake, which is connected to an existing body of water. To take a rewilding perspective on this case study, I'm just going to stop for a second and refer to the 3Ds. These are based on Perino et al.'s 2019 dimensions that I mentioned earlier. In the 3Ds though, the dimensions are described as disturbance, which we've covered in the digging of the pond, diversity, which we're boosting at Clays Lake with supplementary planting, and dispersal. Dispersal requires ecosystem connectivity across the landscape, something that's more of a problem as ponds are removed. However, there are pond analogues which can function in a similar way within our engineered landscape. Everything from drainage ditches to swales, quarry pits to sewage treatment pools can act as a stepping stone for aquatic biodiversity. At Clays Lake, dispersal is provided by the river system, which aided the establishment of aquatic biodiversity. Clearly, there's a difference between these two ecosystems. Lentic species find it harder to travel along the lotic system of a river, but rivers are associated with floodplain pools. When I visited, a few years into the project, the slope above the pond was covered in tiny froglets, and the air was buzzing with damselflies and dragonflies. I disturbed a grass snake, and there was a young family of moorhens swimming across the water. The restoration process had clearly succeeded, and with impressive results. It was impossible to get down to the water due to the abundant growth of marginal plants and even sphagnum moss, which had become firmly established in the 3 years since the pond had been planted out. Some plants, like the sphagnum and the reed mace, had made their way to this pond naturally, but marginal planting helped to kickstart this ecosystem. One significant aspect missing, though, were exposed, muddy sections of bank that you would naturally find in a fully rewilded system. These poached earth edges are caused by large mammals coming down to drink, but in this system, ecosealists were unable to introduce herbivores, and deer are excluded by a fence. This exposed mud is valuable for bees and hirundines like house martins, which use it to build nests. Other invertebrates use it as a breeding habitat, while butterflies land here for mineral deposits. Rivers distribute nutrients, sediments, and organisms, and we can improve this dispersal by slowing a river's flow to mimic a natural system. Many rewilding interventions are therefore designed to slow the flow of water from source to sea, increasing drought resilience, reducing sediment loss, decreasing eutrophication, and creating these more abundant habitats all along the way. Beavers, of course, are the classic example of ticking all of these boxes at once, which is why us rewilders are so keen on them. We would, of course, take a natural beaver wetland over an anthropogenic pond any day. But thinking of this whole river system as one connected entity allows us to appreciate that the state of our ponds will be reflected in the state of our rivers. The more healthy ponds we have, the better the quality of our rivers. Following this logic, we can also enhance a river by restoring an adjacent pond. In the centre of Stroud, at a fishing lake, Ecosoulis employees have constructed these floating reed beds. They're pinned to the edges of the concrete pond that was relatively inhospitable to nature due to its lack of shallow margins. No marginal plants had established along this edge due to the water depth and the hard substrate. This intervention added diversity in a way that not only benefits nature, but also people walking past as a visual amenity. Additionally, the roots can suck up nutrients and pollutants, providing some mitigation. But this isn't the only method for mitigating nutrients that I've seen in practice over the past year. At Warwick University, Ecosoulis restored 2 ponds connected by a ditch, with an inflow from a road and a car park. The outflow joined the local river, so here one of our primary goals was trapping pollutants. These ponds needed desilting. They're an integral part of the drainage system, so creating new ponds elsewhere just wasn't an option. But rather than carting that silt off-site or dumping it on a flower bed only for it to run off again, the team devised a method for using this silt within the existing pond, conserving the biodiversity within it. We shifted the bulk of the silt from the pond bed into newly constructed revetments along the edges of the pond with a floating excavator. Instead of inflows gushing into deep water, they now spilled out across these shallow silty beds, a bit like a delta, which we planted out with common reed. You may well know that the roots of this plant are superb filters for pollutants, nutrients and debris. The reed bed prevents these reaching the river, while creating biodiversity, as other native species were planted in amongst the reeds. But both of these case studies are examples of retrofitting existing ponds with new nature-based solutions. What about creating new ponds? At Ecosoulis, we're also working on ICWs, a treatment system for sewage effluent that typically comes after a sewage treatment works, reducing nutrients and pollutants still further, trapping these in the sediment of a series of ponds. On higher land, we sometimes create new ponds as a byproduct of rewilding. During peatland restoration, we plug up drainage channels and gullies, raising the groundwater level and enabling sphagnum to get re-established. At an Ecosoulis site in Wales, where we're working in partnership with the Lost Peatland Project, I found borrow pits scattered across the bog. These are small ponds created during the peat plug excavation process, but they reminded me of small natural pits, which I've seen while exploring wild peat bogs like those on Dartmoor or in the Highlands. In a peatland system, which is typically quite homogeneous, these pits retain water through the summer. They act as refuges for aquatic life, creating more diversity within the ecosystem. At the site in Wales, I saw several frogs in the borrow pits, one of which is pictured here, which not only act as refuges in terms of drought resilience, but also a deep water refuge from predation. These borrow pits are permanent ponds, but a pond needn't be a permanent system, and ephemeral ponds can also provide economic and biodiversity benefits. You might well have read one of Benedict MacDonald's books on rewilding. If not, I recommend it. When I spoke to him recently about ponds, he described his enthusiasm for those that dry up in summer. Ephemeral ponds are great. They encourage dispersal of the inhabitants throughout the wider landscape, enhancing genetic diversity through interbreeding, and repopulating local water bodies that may have suffered from predation, disease, or other impacts that had caused the species to be wiped out. Amphibians love them as there aren't any predatory fish around. The drier pond beds are also this unique ecosystem which attract lapwings and other damp ground and mud-feeding species through the summer months. People often think of ephemeral ponds as a project that failed, but really, they're a success story, creating a huge boost in local biodiversity and abundance. Now, you may well be aware of these benefits, but the key thing here is communication. Many landowners see a dry pond and assume that something went wrong. That could lead to these scrapes being filled in, repeating the mistakes of the past. The Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group installed great crested newt ponds on farms and dug the 7 on my land. They've also installed 70 in the last 2 years in the place of ponds which have been removed due to succession or infilling. Don't worry, they said when mine went in. It's okay if some dry out, that's just natural. But it's also worth upselling the benefits. The extra things that ephemeral ponds can do, which permanent ponds can't. And ephemeral ponds have value beyond their biodiversity benefits. A study in North America found that the isotope profile of aquifer water closely matched that of ephemeral ponds, but not permanent ponds. This emphasised the role that these temporary water bodies play in topping up these essential underground reservoirs. My neighbouring farmer pumps directly from the aquifer to supply his cattle with drinking water. He often talks to me about the importance of this supply. This is worth bearing in mind when you're communicating with farmers. They have economic importance to landowners. Keeping aquifers topped up also prevents subsidence from groundwater depletion. I've been jumping back and forth between eco-Sulis projects, but now let's take a look at my own case study. It's a 3.5 acre field, effectively in the Somerset Levels. I purchased it in January 2022, and there were 7 ponds installed by FWAG in February 22. Despite the late installation and the severe drought, 3 of them held water throughout the summer last year, as the water table is exceptionally high here on low-lying alluvial soils. This system is minerotrophic, not ombrotrophic. The water levels are determined not determined by rainfall, but by the drainage. But the land is surrounded on all sides by ditches, and these have a huge influence on the pond's depth. The ground is scored at regular intervals by hand-dug ditches, or gripes as they're locally known, and these drain easily into the channels or reams along the field edges. Below the gripes are terracotta mole drains. Nowadays you can also find plastic perforated types. These are tubes which sit underneath the soil and they drain water off the field. Excavating a mole drain in late winter is like hitting oil. You get this sudden gush of water. It's a really good feeling because it means you can block up the drain and begin re-wetting the land upstream. If you don't remove mole drains, they act like this open plug hole. I've seen a pond drop 2 foot overnight due to a mole drain opening up. Now, here's a picture of the ponds after FWAG had finished their work. Those edges there are churned up topsoil. It's not exactly the same as the rooting actions of a wild boar, but it's not actually that different. And the results I got show that this is a useful substitute for that typical first rewilding intervention, given that my land is unsuitable for pigs. Pigs can be difficult to bring into some rewilding projects, partly due to the fact that they need such a low stocking density, and some projects are simply too small for them to work. Now this is what the plant community looked like a few months later. Grass still dominates in areas where ponds weren't dug, but elsewhere there was a massive boost to flowering plants, and a measurable increase in abundance of butterflies and seed-feeding birds. I've had a butterfly conservation volunteer and bird surveyors monitoring the site, and they reported a surge of 48% in birds and butterflies in the hundreds. A stark comparison with the few butterflies reported in a neighbouring pasture, this resurgent abundance is a key early indicator of an effective restoration. So this pond excavation resulting in a boom in butterflies and birds, well, it felt like the unexpected benefits that we got from wolf reintroductions at Yellowstone, on a smaller scale of course. The fear effect it had on elk, which limited riparian browsing, and that allowed beavers to return. Nobody told me that ponds could create invertebrate and bird abundance, but that's exactly what I observed, and the impact is huge. You can see these massive swathes of thistles, these dark green marks, from over a mile away. My project was memorably described as looking like a war zone in early 2022, which made me curious. What's the impact of war zones, of bomb craters, on biodiversity? Researching the topic, I found a fascinating study from Hungary. It examines the impact of bomb craters on both local, alpha, and landscape level, gamma, diversity. The ratio between these two is beta diversity, higher in complex landscapes. The authors describe how bomb crater ponds are often treated like wartime scars, and they're frequently filled in under the guise of habitat restoration. This makes it impossible to quantify their biodiversity value. The study site contained 112 ponds, and these were often clustered together within 1 kilometre square, which was assessed in terms of its value to a range of aquatic organisms. Researchers found a high level of both alpha and gamma diversity in the ponds sampled, and noted that beta diversity also tended to be high. This implied that the strength of the network was not just in the individual ponds, but the presence of multiple ponds within close proximity. This reflects what Flag and others told me when I was planning out my own land. I was advised that a cluster of medium-sized water bodies were of much higher benefit to biodiversity than a single large lake. But why? Clusters of ponds have heterogeneity in many different parameters, from the salinity to the water temperature, permanence of the water through the seasons to predation pressure, nutrient load, etc., etc. Neighbouring ponds on my land vary wildly in appearance. One is clear and rich in plant life, with dense colonies of Daphnia feeding on the plants, while next door it's murky and quiet. This variety creates diversity within the landscape. The report concludes, considering the serious losses of ponds in Europe, bomb crater ponds should be deemed as habitats of outstanding value, treated as core areas of pond conservation, particularly when occurring in dense clusters. But the same goes for many different types of anthropogenic ponds. These systems are highly valuable, not just for aquatic biodiversity, but also for terrestrial species, for our economy, our river system integrity, and nutrient mitigation. When we measure the value of ponds with a DNA analysis, a Great Crested Newt survey, a water chemistry test, or a traditional aquatic species survey, we're really only skimming the surface. This vastly underestimates the pond's overall impact on the wider environment and economy. So let's bring back ponds as a simple and cost-effective way of kicking off rewilding and ecosystem restoration projects. Thank you.